The Last Legacy. Warnings from a Vanished Race. By Elton Gar. Finding anything worthwhile on a barren world was strange. Typically, Evans simply did a mineral survey to determine if there was any reason for a team to examine it further. The 6-foot square metal cube sat on the red stone, a single plant growing in its shade. Small, green and brown, the plant was unlikely to survive. The metal cube didn't appear to be anything useful. Evan tried to imagine any circumstance in which it could be natural, but cubes weren't natural. Even if it had been somehow formed by some strange quirk, something you saw in nature, it would have been worn down by weathering, whether by the sand in the air or the rare rainstorm that would fill the dried riverbeds. But the metal served no purpose. Why would anyone put a large cube of metal on a world with no intelligent life? Why would they make it at all, rather than making something useful from the metal? All he knew was that it hadn't been put here by humans. He had only come to this empty, barren world because no one else had. He had hoped to find a deposit of some rare metal, or some other valuable deposit. He hadn't come to find something as inscrutable as an unexplainable metal cube. The only explanation seemed to be that it had been created by a non-human intelligence. One that either thought far differently from humans, or had technology advanced enough that Evan couldn't understand it. The cube of metal wasn't the first hint of alien life humans had found while exploring the galaxy. There were the ruins of an alien colony on Barav 5. According to the archaeologist, it had been abandoned while humans were still hunter-gatherers. This cube hadn't been here long, at least in the geologic scales of time. That could make this simple metal cube the most important discovery in human history, or it could be a big chunk of metal. Before setting up his transmitter and calling in the experts, Evan planned to examine the cube. Simply being a large piece of metal could be useful. Metal was always at a premium in small colonies. But as an artifact that might have been created by non-humans, it was underwhelming. There was no strange radiation, no markings, and it wasn't even an interesting alloy. With night approaching, Evan erected his tent and attached the solar sheet to power his tools while his horse continued to graze on the patches of moss that were barely thick enough to feed Nomad. Evan would give the horse several pills before he went to sleep to keep her healthy. By the time he had finished setting up his camp, it was getting dark, so he set up his printer while cooking a can of beans over a small fire. Then he fell asleep while searching his tablet's database for anything similar to the cube. When he woke up halfway through the night, the printer had stopped, as had the heater in his tent. Even the fire had burnt down to embers, leaving him in what should have been total silence. Instead, there was a deep, low tone he could barely hear in the total silence of the night. So he crawled out of the tent in the blackness of a moonless alien night to check on the block of metal. The cube was glowing, but so dimly that even in the darkness, it barely made it easier to see. Evan stood in the chill, dry night air for several minutes, then moved back into his tent and watched the cube through one of the small windows. That was how he saw Nomad approach the metal cube. The horse hadn't shown any interest in the cube, but this time he poked the metal box with his nose and disappeared in a flash of white light. Evan started to set up his beacon, but then reconsidered. There was no one nearby who would be much help. That meant he would have to contact the military. The military would send ships, and as soon as they saw the cube, they would take over. So he folded the beacon and put it back in its box. He then packed all the supplies, including his tent, and approached the metal cube. He watched it for a moment, then poked the metal box with his flashlight. He half expected the flashlight to disappear. Nothing happened. Putting the flashlight in the loop on his belt, he reached out and touched the cube with his finger. He felt an electric shock, and he took a surprised step back. Instead of dry stone, Evan was standing on a metal floor. He was in a massive square room with metal walls. He couldn't explain that. Teleportation was impossible. People had been trying for centuries and had never successfully moved anything more than a few atoms. But even if it were possible, a metal building this size would have been seen by the survey drones. His next best explanation was hallucinations. But assuming it required physical contact, then it wouldn't explain Nomad disappearing an hour earlier. If it didn't require contact, then why had it waited? There was also basic pragmatism. If he was hallucinating, then it wouldn't matter, but if it was real, every second could count. No matter the explanation, it was working alien technology, and that would make it worth a fortune. While he tried to figure out how to escape this place so he could become rich, a creature walked into the room. It was taller than Evan and with a human form, though its face was too long, the ears were pointed, and it had brown and white fur over much of its body. It was the hair that clued him in on what this was, and he relaxed considerably. The creature wasn't an alien. It was a conflation of the appearance of Evan and Nomad. That confirmed the hypothesis that this was a virtual reality or something similar. It also suggested it was being run by a computer. It was hard to imagine any intelligent life form thinking that appearing half horse and half human was a good way to make first contact. But a computer algorithm may have been designed to approximate the life forms it discovered.
"Hello,"
Evan said. He didn't expect a response, but he didn't know what else to do. There were a few seconds of silence, then the creature looked towards him and said,
"Hello."
It then turned and began to walk, and as it did, a tunnel appeared. Evan followed. Images began to appear. They were all images from the most important moments in Evan's life. He saw his first kiss, his first breakup, his graduation, his father's death, his first love and their breakup, even choosing to become a scout. Seeing it all made him angry. How dare they invade his private thoughts? How dare they put it up for anyone to see? But as he walked, he calmed himself. There was no one else here, unless you counted Nomad. This was just a computer trying to understand him well enough to communicate. They walked through the tunnel for hours. The first time he watched Lord of the Rings, the best pizza he ever ate, his first time landing on a world no human had ever visited. Then, with no warning, they walked into a large open room filled not with images but people. It held parents, school teachers, old friends, and even a couple of ex-girlfriends. Anyone who he could close his eyes and imagine clearly was here. Evan's father stepped out of the crowd and approached. He towered over Evan. At least 10 feet tall. Evan knew his father hadn't actually been a giant. But he had died when Evan was 10, and so every memory he had of his father was him towering over Evan.
"It's good to see you,"
he said. It sounded exactly how he remembered his father, but how could it not? This simulacrum was built from his memories.
"What is this place?"
Evan asked. He suspected he could get lost here in his own memories, but that wasn't why he was here.
"It is a temple and an archive. You might call it a library,"
another person said. It was one of the professors from Evan's university.
"Who built it?"
Evan asked.
"The last people,"
one of the colonists said.
"The last of your people, you mean?"
Evan said.
"The last of any civilized people. There were 4 races who traveled between stars. We were the last of them,"
his father said.
"And you're gone now, too,"
Evan said.
"but you are here, and we believe you can follow a different path,"
his mother said. She moved next to his father, leaning against him like she often did in Evan's earliest memories. In this weird dream place, she was somehow both almost as tall as Evan's father and 2 inches shorter than Evan.
"What happened to you?"
Evan asked.
"We learned and grew,"
The professor said.
"That sounds like a good thing,"
Evan said. He had seen technologies that made him uncomfortable. People who plugged their minds into computers and disappeared, computers as smart as people, and of course, weapons. But everyone had assumed that once humans left Earth, they had become effectively immortal, because while the weapons could kill billions, there were always more worlds filled with people.
It was good. Everyone had their needs met and could do what they wanted. And every new discovery gave more freedom and power to the individual.
Another man said.
"I'm still not clear on how any of that is bad,"
Evan said. Earth's government wasn't terrible, but it wasn't perfect either. If you lived on any of the civilized worlds, there were rules about everything, and almost all of those rules took power from individuals and gave it to the government.
We didn't either until the first individual created a virus that killed everyone on a planet, a member of one of the other races, but we were not so dissimilar that we should have ignored it,
His mother said.
Most of us dismissed it as an anomaly. But every year, people gained more power, and there were always a handful of people who slipped through the cracks. Some had biological insanity, others were simply angry or wanted to be important. What mattered was that each of them had so much power they could kill millions or even billions of people.
We had viruses, swarms of nanites, automated ships, artificially intelligent computer programs, all used to destroy. Each of them is an isolated Armageddon that few of us connected to a single problem, and none of us found a solution for.
Eventually, even the most skeptical couldn't ignore the destruction. But what could we do? No one was willing to give up the technology that had created our fragile utopia, so we scattered ourselves across the galaxy. We tried to live with less technology, and some abandoned it entirely, but that didn't stop those with technology from using it against us. We were conquered and became part of the whole again. A whole that was destroying itself.
His father said.
So you built an archive and left it here to warn the next people.
Evan said.
We built a billion archives and sent them everywhere in hopes that some would survive. And some have. This is one, but it is not the first to be found by your people,
His mother said.
But I'd know about that.
Evan said.
At least a dozen have been found, but your people have ignored our warnings.
His professor said.
They didn't tell us about them.
Evan said.
It might not matter. You can't stop technology from advancing.
A man said. He was one of the men who Evan worked with. Evan suspected he was talking to a group of people who might not even all agree on what to do.
Perhaps we won't do the same thing,
Evan said, but he knew it was a stupid statement. Every year there were stories of people who went insane, attacking a school or their own families, and it seemed almost inevitable that some, given the chance, would kill as many people as they could. It wouldn't take many. If 1 out of 1,000,000 people were willing to commit mass murder, then every civilized world would have someone waiting for the opportunity to destroy it.
We know your mind and see lies in your words,
His mother said.
And do you know what I will do?
Evan asked.
You will remember our warning and tell a few people, but not many. You will decide that it is better for them to live without knowing the sword of Damocles hangs over their head, especially if their leaders already know,
His father said. Evan wanted to argue, to tell them that he would shout their warning from the rooftops, that he would become a prophet warning of destruction, but he knew it wasn't true. He would simply watch for the signs and hope someone would find a solution that 4 alien races had failed to find. Author's note.
It seems like every week you hear about someone attacking people. It typically comes up in the form of spree shootings, but there are others too. People who drive their car into a crowd or build a bomb. The other thing I see regularly in the news is the advancement of technology, and while there are many types of advancement, many of them allow people to become more efficient. This story takes place at the intersection of those two ideas. And it's one of the stories I have written that scares me the most, because if we don't find a way to help the mentally unstable from deciding they want to take everyone with them, eventually, one of them will use the power technology has given them to do far more damage. On that happy note, I say goodbye. I hope you found my story interesting, and if you want to read more, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.ansci-fi.com. Simply look for the free book link. And if you want to read all my short stories, including patron exclusives, you can sign up at www.patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.